In the morning after breakfast, in the afternoon during the children's nap, in the evening before dinner, and again at night before bed. 4 times a day, sometimes more. What was once natural and shared has become a constant, almost mechanical demand. At first, I thought it was normal for all couples to go through these adjustment phases. I remember that evening when, exhausted from my day with our first baby, I gently explained to Kareem that I needed rest. His expression changed, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of anger in his eyes. He didn't say anything that night, but I sensed that something had changed. Months passed and the situation deteriorated. Kareem, who works as a consultant and manages his own schedule, got into the habit of coming home in the middle of the morning and early afternoon. At first, I thought he just wanted to spend time with me and the kids, but I soon realized that these visits had only one purpose. Every day, it became an oppressive ritual. I had become an object available at his convenience, with no consideration for my feelings, my fatigue, or my own desires. When I began to express my weariness, his reactions became increasingly violent. No physical abuse at first, but hurtful words, veiled threats, constant psychological pressure. "It's your duty as a wife," he would repeat. "A woman who refuses her husband attracts the curse of the angels," he would add, distorting religious teachings to justify his demands. One day, while tidying his bedside table, I discovered boxes of dietary supplements, natural aphrodisiacs, and even medications that he had obtained without a prescription. I then realized that my husband was taking substances to increase his libido and performance, transforming our intimacy into a chemically fueled obsession. I realized that it was no longer love or even natural desire. It had become an addiction, a compulsive need that he was artificially feeding. My 4-year-old son would sometimes ask me why Daddy was angry, why Mommy was crying in the bathroom. How do you explain to a child that his mother feels dispossessed of her own body? I tried to talk to Kareem about my feelings, my fatigue, my need for space and affection without ulterior motives, but my words hit a wall of incomprehension and anger. To him, I had simply become difficult and ungrateful. He didn't see the exhausted woman I had become. He only saw a wife who was no longer fulfilling her obligations. My friends noticed my constant fatigue, my dark circles, my weight loss. But how could I explain such an intimate situation without feeling like I was betraying my family? Society teaches us to protect the image of our relationship. I began to develop an aversion to physical intimacy. My body recoiled every time Kareem approached me. I no longer felt any pleasure, only painful resignation, and sometimes revulsion. This reaction only increased his frustration and anger. The day Kareem hit me for the first time remains etched in my memory. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had refused his advances because I was on my period and didn't feel well. His hand came down on my cheek with a violence that surprised me as much as the physical pain. "You have no right to refuse me," he shouted. "I am your husband. You owe me obedience." That slap marked the beginning of a new phase in our relationship. Refusal was now punished with beatings, shoving, and sometimes more violent assaults. Kareem justified his violence with religion, quoting verses taken out of context and interpreting the sacred texts as he saw fit. I lived in constant fear, afraid to say no, afraid to upset my husband, afraid that the children would witness his anger. My home had become a prison of which I was both the guardian and the prisoner. Desperate, I tried to talk to my mother-in-law. But how could I broach such an intimate subject with a woman who believed that marital problems should be dealt with in the privacy of the home? Her reaction was predictable. A husband has needs, and a wife must satisfy them. That's how our mothers lived. That's how you must live too. I then tried to broach the subject with my own mother. That conversation remains one of the most painful of my life. When I mentioned the possibility of Kareem taking a second wife to relieve the pressure on me, her reaction was categorical. "You can't encourage your husband to take another wife. That's cowardly. A wife fights for her home. She doesn't abandon it to another woman." But my mother didn't understand that I wasn't abandoning anything. I was losing myself, gradually disappearing under the weight of impossible demands. Months passed, and I entered a phase of total exhaustion. My body was no longer responding. My mind was constantly foggy. I was functioning on autopilot. Getting the children up, preparing meals, putting up with Kareem's demands, putting the children to bed, and starting all over again the next day. I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize myself anymore. My eyes were dull, my smile forced, my joie de vivre completely extinguished. I felt like I had become a ghost in my own existence. The children were beginning to be affected by the atmosphere in the house. My eldest son was having nightmares. My 2-year-old daughter had become very agitated. He sensed the tension even though he didn't understand its source. That's when I realized that my situation was affecting not only my own life, but also that of my children. This realization was the trigger I needed to start looking for solutions. In my desperation, I began to search for solutions on my own. I discreetly consulted websites, discussion forums, and books on sexuality and couples. I was trying to understand if what I was experiencing was normal, if other women were going through the same thing. That's when I discovered that what I was going through had a name. Marital rape. This revelation came as a shock. In my culture, in my upbringing, the very concept of rape within marriage was unthinkable, taboo, denied. I tried to broach the subject with Kareem during one of his rare moments of calm. I tried to explain my feelings, my suffering, my need to regain intimacy based on mutual respect and love. His reaction was explosive. You're becoming a Western feminist. You're forgetting your values, your religion. A Muslim wife doesn't talk like that. My younger sister was the only person with whom I could still have sincere conversations. She had noticed my change in attitude, my constant sadness, my repeated excuses when she called me to come home quickly. One day, she confronted me directly. Samira, what's really going on in your marriage? You haven't been yourself for months. I told her everything. The incessant demands, the beatings, the fear, the exhaustion. She had been married for 3 years herself and couldn't conceive of a husband treating his wife that way. But what could I do? Leave with 2 young children? Get a divorce and face society's judgment? Or stay and continue to suffer, hoping that things would get better? The breaking point came one evening during Ramadan. Ironically, during this holy month of purification and spirituality, Kareem had become even more demanding. He claimed that his needs were increased tenfold by fasting, and that it was my duty to help him satisfy them. That evening, I was sick. I had a high fever, a headache, and fatigue that kept me bedridden. Kareem came home after breaking his fast and, despite my obvious condition, demanded that I fulfill his desires. I am sick, Kareem. Please let me rest tonight. He grabbed me by the hair, dragged me out of bed, and beat me with a brutality I had never experienced before. My children, awakened by my screams, were crying in their room. At that moment, I realized that I had to choose between dying a slow death in this toxic relationship or finding the courage to save my life and that of my children. That night, lying on the floor of my bedroom, my body aching and my soul broken, I had a revelation. What I was experiencing had nothing to do with the Islam I had learned as a child. My grandmother's Islam was one of compassion, respect, and love between spouses. I thought back to the stories my grandmother told me about the Prophet and his wives. He had never forced himself on any of them. He had never raised his hand to them. He had never treated their needs and feelings with contempt. This realization was liberating. I was not a bad wife. I was not a bad Muslim. I was a woman who was suffering violence that nothing, absolutely nothing, could justify. The day after that horrible night, I made a decision that would change my life. I contacted an organization that helps women who are victims of domestic violence. Just saying the words, "I am a victim of domestic violence," on the phone was a painful but necessary moment of truth. The counselor who spoke to me was a kind woman who listened without judgment. She explained my rights, the options available to me, and the steps I needed to take to protect myself and my children. "You are not responsible for what you are going through," she told me. "No religion or culture justifies domestic violence." Those words were like a balm on my wounds. For the first time in years, I no longer felt alone in my ordeal. It took several weeks to prepare to leave this toxic relationship. I had to be strategic, think about my children's safety, gather the necessary documents, and find temporary accommodation. My sister supported me in all these steps. She helped me open a personal bank account, gather my identity papers and those of the children, and pack a bag with essential items. The hardest part was keeping it a secret from Kareem. I had to continue playing the role of the submissive wife while preparing my escape. Every day was a struggle not to let my intentions show. The day finally arrived. Kareem had left on a 3-day business trip. It was the perfect opportunity. With my sister's help, I gathered our essential belongings, took the children, and we left the house that had become our prison. I remember the moment I closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding, but for the first time in years, it was excitement and hope, not fear. We went to a temporary shelter for women who are victims of violence. The place was simple, but it represented something I hadn't known in a long time: safety. The first few weeks were a mix of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, there was immense relief at no longer having to endure Kareem's constant demands. On the other, the anxiety of the unknown, the fear of my family's and society's reactions. It took my children a while to adjust, but I quickly noticed positive changes. They smiled more, slept better, and were less restless. They too felt this liberation, even if they couldn't fully understand it. Kareem tried to contact me in many ways. Messages, calls, visits from family members. His promises of change alternated with threats and emotional blackmail, but I had made my decision and nothing would change my mind. As I expected, my in-laws' reaction was hostile. I had become the woman who had destroyed a home, the one who had abandoned her duties as a wife. The accusations rained down. Selfishness, ingratitude, bad Western influence. My mother, although worried, finally understood the seriousness of my situation when she saw the bruises on my arms. My father, more traditional, had a hard time accepting my decision, but he respected my choice. Some people around me were surprising. Friends I thought were conservative supported me unconditionally. Others I felt close to turned their backs on me. These trials taught me to distinguish true friendships from superficial relationships. I had to relearn how to live for myself, to make decisions without fear of the consequences, to rediscover who I was beyond the role of submissive wife that I had taken on. I began therapy to treat the trauma I had suffered. Talking about my experiences with a professional helped me understand the mechanisms of domestic violence and let go of my guilt. Gradually, I regained my self-confidence. I went back to school to get a professional qualification. The idea of becoming financially independent was exhilarating. For the first time in my adult life, I was charting my own course. Paradoxically, it was by leaving this toxic relationship that I rediscovered my authentic faith. Far from Kareem's twisted interpretations of religion, I was able to rediscover the true essence of Islam: compassion, justice, and respect for human dignity. I began to seriously study religious texts, not to justify blind submission, but to understand the true values of my faith. This process reconciled me with my spirituality and gave me the strength to continue. I realized that God could not want a woman to suffer in silence, to sacrifice her mental and physical health to satisfy the whims of a violent husband. This revelation was liberating. After 8 months in the shelter, I was able to rent a small apartment with my children. It was modest, but it was ours. Every corner of that small space exuded freedom and peace. I found a part-time job that allowed me to balance work and raising my children. My colleagues didn't know about my past, and that was perfect. I felt like I was reborn, starting a new life. The children flourished in this new environment. They learned that human relationships could be based on respect and love, not fear and domination. That lesson was worth all the sacrifices I had to make. Today, 2 years after I left, I can say that I have found peace. The scars are still there, probably forever, but they no longer define who I am. They are part of my history, but they no longer dictate my future. I have learned to forgive, not to excuse Kareem's actions, but to free my heart from the resentment that was poisoning it. Forgiveness is a gift I gave myself, not him. My children are growing up in a healthy and balanced environment. They are learning that true love does not hurt, that respect is the basis of all human relationships, that no one has the right to violate the dignity of another. Today, when I think back on those years of suffering, I feel a mixture of sadness for the woman I was and pride in the woman I have become. I realized that my quest for marital peace had led me to accept the unacceptable. In wanting to preserve the image of a harmonious home, I had sacrificed my well-being and that of my children. This reflection now drives me to encourage other women in similar situations not to give up. This experience also taught me the importance of authentic religious education. Too often, sacred texts are misused to justify injustice. It is crucial that we, as Muslim women, take ownership of our religion and refuse to allow it to be used against us. Samira's story challenges us on several fundamental aspects of Islamic teaching that are unfortunately often misunderstood or misused. Islam teaches that intimacy between spouses should be based on mutual love, tenderness, and respect. The Quran reminds us in Surah 30, verse 21, that God has placed affection and mercy between spouses. This affection cannot exist in a climate of coercion and violence. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "The best among you is the one who is best to his family, and I am the best among you to my family." This authentic hadith shows us that a man's excellence is measured by how he treats his family with gentleness and respect. Islam accords women inalienable dignity. The Quran states in Surah 4, verse 19, "It is not lawful for you to inherit women against their will. Do not prevent them from remarrying in order to take away part of what you have given them, unless they commit a proven sin. Behave properly towards them." This verse emphasizes the importance of consent and kind treatment of wives. No religious interpretation can justify physical or psychological coercion in marital intimacy. Islam advocates consultation in important decisions made by the couple. The Quran mentions in Surah 42 verse 38 that believers consult with each other in their affairs. This consultation must also apply in the intimacy of the couple, where the needs and limits of each spouse must be respected. Islam recognizes a woman's right to seek divorce in cases of harm. Muslim jurists have established that domestic violence constitutes major harm, justifying the dissolution of marriage. A woman is not required to endure violence in the name of preserving the home. Contrary to popular belief, Islam strongly encourages women's education. The Prophet said, "The pursuit of knowledge is an obligation for every Muslim man and woman." This obligation includes knowing one's rights and being able to defend them. Islam teaches that the community has a responsibility to protect its vulnerable members. Silence in the face of domestic violence goes against the Quranic obligation to enjoin good and forbid evil. Surah 3 verse 104. Samira's story shows us that even in the most difficult trials, authentic faith can be a source of strength and healing. The Quran promises us in Surah 65 verse 2 that whoever fears God, He will give them a favorable outcome. This divine promise does not mean that we must passively accept injustice, but rather that we must trust in God while taking lawful means to improve our situation. Islam teaches us that God has given us reason and free will to distinguish between good and evil. Using these faculties to protect ourselves from violence and protect our children is not a lack of faith. On the contrary, it is an act of responsibility towards the gifts that God has given us. My dear brothers and sisters, Samira's story reminds us that true Islam is a religion of justice, compassion, and human dignity. Any interpretation that goes against these fundamental values must be questioned and rejected. May this story inspire us to create communities where every woman, every man, every child can live in safety and respect. May we be guardians of one another, as our beautiful religion teaches us. May God guide us toward what is right, and give us the strength to defend the oppressed. For that is the true message of Islam. Please share this video if it has touched you. And especially if you know someone who is going through a similar situation, reach out to them. Sometimes a simple gesture of solidarity can save a life.